promise them salvation, cover up the path, scare them with damnation. Lead them anywhere, you can lead them anywhere. Teach them shame and guilt, stimulate their fears, make them doubt themselves. Lead them anywhere, you can lead them anywhere. Now that they are sleeping, lead them anywhere. Build around them borders, encumber them with laws, replace their names with numbers. Lead them anywhere, you can lead them anywhere. Beat those who are different, disown the ones who fail, refuse those who are destitute. Lead them anywhere, you can lead them anywhere. Now that they are sleeping, lead them anywhere.
The second coming of Jesus, the high priest.
390 days from the bombing of the trade towers in New York, according to the 4th chapter of Ezekiel, will be the full-scale destruction of New York City.
Not teach a gospel of so-called brotherly love among other races, as very commonly portrayed today as Jesus' teachings. He came only for his own race, the white race, Aryan, or Adamic race.
Sacrifice, reward them for obedience. Lead them anywhere, you can lead them anywhere. Starve the non-producers, mock enlightened minds, kill the troublemakers. Lead them anywhere, you can lead them anywhere. Now that they are sleeping, lead them anywhere. Lead them anywhere, you can lead them anywhere. Lead them anywhere, you can lead them anywhere. Now that they are sleeping,
2001, we expect the first spacecraft to land.
Now that they are sleeping,
And his love protecting here, I am his love protecting here.
lead them anywhere. Now that they are sleeping, you can lead them anywhere.
I really got involved in the organization of this meeting tonight at the last minute when a student came to me and asked me if I would participate and would introduce our speaker. I said I would on condition that I learn something about him first, and insisted that I see his resume and other materials, and we got a chance to talk to him. After I did that, well, actually I found out today from Keith that that was the right thing to do, that you should never get involved in a group until you've investigated a little bit, so I did that. My reason for being involved here is to see that we get a good exchange of information. I would like to see us promote public discussion about the topics, and I hope we'll have a good, lively discussion. Our guest tonight is Keith Mader, to my right. He's a former member of the Church Universal and Triumphant. He is has a Master's of Social Work from Rutgers University. He currently works as a counselor and psychotherapist in the Jackson Hole, Wyoming area. He's been there since 1983, I think that's right. He's currently a school social worker in Wilson, Wyoming, and also works in residential schools in Du Bois and Big Piney, Wyoming. He also directs a wilderness program at the CV Ranch in Wilson, Wyoming, and is a psychotherapist for the Human Resource Associates of Jackson Hole, Wyoming. So he's a very busy guy, and he's taken time out from his busy schedule to drive all the way up here in some not so very good weather, and got in late last night. So I hope you'll give him a big welcome. He's going to speak tonight on the problems of destructive cults and destructive groups and the truth about cults. He says he's going to talk about how to identify destructive groups and hopefully how to avoid them, how they attract their members and how they keep them, how they recognize how to recognize the leaders of these kinds of groups and some of their deceptive practices, and how to become aware of the psychological manipulation that's sometimes involved. Question I think that some of you may have is who is the sponsoring organization for this, and the answer is there isn't one. This apparently is a group of concerned people in the Bozeman area who are interested in getting some information out to the public. So without further ado, I think you'll find Keith an exciting, interesting speaker. He drove a long way to entertain us and enlighten us tonight, and so I hope you'll give him a warm welcome.
Thank you. Good evening. Thank you for the nice welcome. I'm glad to be here. I hope that tonight I can supply you all with some information that will raise your awareness as to what cults are, how to identify such a group, how such groups are defined, characteristics of destructive cults, and ultimately how to prevent yourselves from becoming involved, or people that you love from becoming involved in such destructive groups. We're living in an age where we regularly learn of horrors being committed by cults and other fanatical groups. Many of us vividly recall the sensational stories, the ones that make the news and the newspapers, such as the 913 members of the People's Temple dying at the hand of their leader, Jim Jones, or the fiery Holocaust at the Branch Davidian compound near Waco, Texas, or the more recent events in Tokyo linking the murderous gassing of the subway system to the Aum Shinrikyo cult. Most of us truly are saddened and shocked by these stories, yet they remain in the realm of the sensational. We tend not to get too far past questions of how this happened and why it happened. The answers we tend to arrive at, because of the media oftentimes, is the how and why probably has something to do with crazy, imbalanced, fanatical people somewhere out there. That it must have been something wrong with those people to have been involved in such horrific groups and such seemingly bizarre groups. And then after the events pass, the entire thing tends to get passed off or shrugged off as just some sensational event that happened to those crazy people out there, and we move on. But we never seem to really get below the surface of those crazy people and that thing out there. Most people don't recognize the full extent of the cult problem in the United States, and that those crazy people in those weird groups out there somewhere are really our children, our friends, our neighbors, and relatives living with us in our communities. Cults are a very real problem in this country and in communities such as Bozeman and this surrounding area. There's an accounting of some 1,500 to 3,000 fanatical groups, destructive cult groups in the U.S. alone, affecting millions of people. Cults fit generally into one of four broad categories: religious, political, psychotherapeutic or human development, and commercial groups. People don't recognize, or a lot of people don't recognize, that cults don't have to be religious in nature to be termed a cult, that they can hide behind many different types of guises beyond religion. Among some of the more well-known cults that some of us may have heard of, the Unification Church, or the Moonies, the Hare Krishna movement, EST, which has become the Forum, the Children of God, Lyndon LaRouche's group, Amway International, Transcendental Meditation, and Montana is the residence of a group that can be defined as a destructive cult and fits the criteria, the Church Universal and Triumphant, which this particular group has received a great deal of media attention in recent years for its apocalyptic prophecies, accumulations of illegal weapons, and building of bomb shelters in preparation for an Armageddon. This brings the cult problem home for many of you, as these are your neighbors, and these are your children, and this is your community. I do not use the term destructive cult lightly or arbitrarily or loosely. No one wants to fall in the trap, including myself, of arbitrarily deciding which group is okay and which group is not okay. To be a destructive cult, it must meet specific criteria which sets it apart from legitimate, healthy religious or other organizations. In a broad way, we can look at 4 key elements that fit into a definition of a destructive cult. And those elements would include, first, an authoritarian, divinely inspired leader who claims to have some connection to the supernatural world or to God or some hold on the truth and omniscient knowledge somehow. The second would be the misuse of mind-altering techniques, such as trance techniques, hypnotic techniques that are used on unwittingly suspecting followers, put them into a trance state. Use of deception and recruitment, and in what this group is going to do for your life and what's going to happen to you as a result of being in the group. And finally, the employment of thought reform or mind control techniques, which is very involved, and I'll touch upon that later. These 4 characteristics, or these 4 key elements, authoritarian leader, misuse of mind-altering techniques, use of deception, and the employment of thought reform techniques will be fleshed out more as I get into the specific characteristics of what make up a cult. All the characteristics that I will go through in a little while will fit into one of these 4 characteristics, or key elements. Why are they destructive, people ask? A lot of the times their destructive elements or their harmful effects are hidden from the public at large, because we hear destructive and we think of something blowing up or somebody being killed or something that really jumps out at us. And there are those kinds of things too, but more what we see when we're looking at destructive cults are the causing of serious mental and emotional problems as a result of involvement in such groups, destruction of relationships, alienation and cutoff from friends, family, relatives, from the people that are meaningful, the people that give support to members, physical and sexual abuse and neglect within groups, child abuse and neglect, loss of free will through the group taking control over one's life, the inability to any longer make your own decisions or think for yourself, crimes committed against individual and society for the greater good of the group, health problems related to poor diet, sleep deprivation, and stress, financial problems due to loss of employment, turning over one's money and assets to the group, and the arrest of psychological, emotional, spiritual, and social development while in the group. This is why cults are harmful. And as you look into any particular group that is labeled as a destructive cult, I guarantee you, if it truly fits the criteria, you will find reams of information on the harm and destruction they've brought to people's lives. I want to talk for a second, before I go further, about civil liberties issues. Many cults, including the Church Universal and Triumphant here in your community, claim that they are the victims, of religious persecution, and that their First Amendment rights to freedom of religion is being attacked and threatened by its critics. I'm here to tell you that I believe that these groups really hide behind the First Amendment as a smokescreen to the real issues, to the real harm that they cause. I fully support First Amendment rights for all religions and and the freedom of speech and the freedom of religion, and a group's freedom to believe what they want to believe and to practice. What I call into question, and many people in the cult awareness movement call into question, is a group's unethical and sometimes immoral practices. And practices is the operative term here. How their doctrine and what they believe, how that translates into practice and what happens to people as a result, and the actual and potential harm they are causing individuals, families, communities, and our society. This is not a religious issue. This is an issue of harmful acts being committed against people. The First Amendment is thrown out there because it's a common rallying point. Certainly all of us want to ensure that First Amendment freedom of religious rights are protected. It's one of the strengths and beauties of our country. And so the cults can throw that out and people rally around that point, not knowing the true practices of the particular group who they're coming to defend. The First Amendment does not protect any group, religious or not, to deliberately manipulate, control, and cause harm. Groups such as CUT scream religious and Church Universal and Triumphant, which I will refer to as CUT, scream religious intolerance to draw attention away from the destructive practices of the group and to evoke a rallying point for those uneducated about who and what they really are. Before I get further into characteristics of a destructive cult, I want to talk a little bit about who joins cults and why. Are they really just those crazy, imbalanced, dumb people out there? And I'm here to tell you no. The research, and there's been a lot of research done, shows that the typical recruit into a cult is average to above average intelligence. They're intellectually curious people oftentimes. They're idealistic. They want to do something good for themselves, something good for their community, something good for the world. They're looking for answers oftentimes. They're searching. Often high school and or college educated, and come from middle to upper middle class socioeconomic backgrounds and between the ages of 20 and 35 years old. Cults, as I'll talk further later, are really sort of like business machines in a lot of ways, trying their best to recruit and fundraise. That's the driving force that keeps cults alive, recruitment and fundraising, so as to keep membership up and keep the leaders propped up. No organization is going to survive in the recruitment and fundraising area if the people they're recruiting in are imbalanced, dumb, emotionally unstable people. Those are not the type of people that cults want. They're not the type of people that are going to work for the group's cause and be highly functioning in the group. They want high-functioning people. So why do people get involved then? That would be the next question. Why do people end up in destructive cults? And the main thing that we can glean from the research again is vulnerabilities. That people at different times in their lives, for different reasons, are vulnerable. They're vulnerable to different types of cults for different reasons. And there isn't a person in this room that hasn't experienced some kind of vulnerability in their own lives that would render them susceptible to being recruited into a cult, especially if that cult presented itself, or that group presented itself as something that could meet your need, whatever that particular need was, and fulfill it at that time. Vulnerabilities would include spiritually searching, looking for answers in the spiritual world and fulfillment spiritually. People with medical problems, terminal medical problems, chronic medical problems, who can't seem to get the answers from traditional medical community are often vulnerable because they're desperate, looking for answers. People in major transitions in their lives, and we all have transitions into new jobs, moving, graduating high school, going to college for the first time, leaving college. Times when we're untethered maybe from our identity, who we are and what we should be doing, or we're untethered socially where we don't have friends or groups of people to associate with. Those occur in transition times, or when we're stressed out and anxious over our transition and we're looking for a supportive ear, someone who will listen, someone who cares. Times when we're alone. Loss can be a time of vulnerability, the loss of a loved one through death or divorce. Can be a very vulnerable time for people. People who are having certain emotional problems because of things happening in their lives, situational, emotional problems. Financial difficulties. There's a whole uprising of business-type cults that promise money and success through very, very minimal efforts. Identity issues, who you are, what you are. Sense of belonging, I talked about that. And if you're at the right place at the right time, or maybe I should say the wrong place at the wrong time, with one of these vulnerabilities, and you come in contact with someone who's searching for someone with one of those kinds of vulnerabilities, you are ripe for being recruited into a group. I would have never believed it could happen to me if it didn't happen to me. And so I don't blame a lot of you for sitting out there thinking, that could never happen to me. I could never be that vulnerable. You would be surprised at how insidious and how benign it seems when you're getting recruited into a group. It's not some thing where there's neon lights flashing, cult, 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 or somebody with a bald, shaved head and tambourines and saris, or some satanic villain ready to suck your blood or something. If it was that obvious, we probably wouldn't have the problem we have right now in this country and in your community. It's a lot more subtle, it's a lot more insidious. They're the people that look just like your neighbors here tonight. They're the people that look like me. Normal people. And that's what makes it harder to defend and to protect ourselves against being recruited into a group, is because the disguise is so clever and it is so insidious that we really have to be on the ball. We really have to know what we're looking for to keep ourselves protected. I'd like to get into more of the body of my talk now in terms of characteristics, typical characteristics of a destructive cult, for the main purposes that you would be able to identify a cult versus a legitimate, healthy organization, and that you can gain some understanding of how cults work and can control and victimize their members. Throughout my talk, I will focus my examples primarily on Church Universal and Triumphant. One, because they have local relevance for you in this community here. There are other cultic activities or signs of cultic activities in this community, but CUT is clearly the one that stands out and is the most obvious. Second, I know this group the best. I was a member of Church Universal and Triumphant for about 3 years. And having been a member and lived the experience of being under their thought reform program and experiencing the harmful effects in my own life, I feel that I'm in a position to speak with you about that with some authority. What do you look for to identify a group as a destructive cult? First, you would, these aren't necessarily any order of priority, but number one, that you would identify a black and white worldview, a polarized worldview, good and evil worldview. That everything within the group is good and real and right and just and true, and everything outside of the group is the opposite, is unreal, is not truthful, is evil. And so the polarization is set up right from the beginning in a group. The us versus them mentality. We in here versus those of them out there. CUT believes it holds the one ultimate truth and that it represents goodness and reality. People in the group believe they are the chosen ones delivering God's progressive revelation. through the messenger, Elizabeth Clare Prophet. All is goodness, purity, and truth within the group, while the opposite is viewed of those outside. There's no allowance for gray areas, no dialogue. There's just a polarization between those who are in and those who are out. Either you believe totally in our doctrine and who we say we are, or you don't believe. You're either with us or you're against us. And I found that to be very true in my involvement in CUT. Next, a destructive cult claims to have the answers, all of the answers, to life's problems, to your problems, to the world's problems. That if you follow their recipe, if you buy into their beliefs, if you're committed enough, dedicate yourself enough, loyal enough, that you will be shown the answers. And your problems, life's problems, the world's problems will be solved. A panacea. They offer themselves as a panacea. In Church Universal and Triumphant, supposedly God has chosen Elizabeth Clare Prophet to deliver his word. Elizabeth Clare Prophet claims to have direct connection to all of God's knowledge and wisdom, and therefore has the answers to everything social, political, personal, spiritual. She's omniscient. You cannot question or dispute information that comes directly from God. Elizabeth, like many cult leaders, claims that God is speaking directly to them and that she simply is the mouthpiece for God. There's no way to question or dispute information, as I say, that comes from God. You either believe it or you don't believe it. There's no dialogue, no questioning, no middle ground. That's a dangerous position to be in, to have to totally accept everything you hear from a person as the truth, and not being allowed to have your own questions, your own thoughts, your own skepticism about something. It leaves people very vulnerable to be manipulated and controlled. One thing that you'll notice with destructive cults, and some cults may have some of these characteristics and some may not, but this covers the gamut, is love bombing. It's called love bombing. That as you are drawn into the group, one of the main tactics into a group is that members act as if they instantly love you the minute they meet you, that they shower you with warmth, affection, and attention. They make you feel special, important, that you're cared for, that they're glad you're there. This oftentimes is very artificial because it's a deception and a manipulation. It's calculated. If we can be nice enough to this person and friendly enough at their time of need, we can begin to hook them in to our organization. The same happened for me coming into Church Universal and Triumphant. I began attending groups, a small Sunday service group where I was living, and my wife and I would go together, and we were considered the two most wonderful people they had ever met. In fact, they thought we were soulmates. Okay, they thought, even beyond that, possibly we were even twin flames, which in CUT jargon, that's about as good as it can get, finding your twin flame in the spiritual cosmos. They really built us up. They made it feel special and important that we were there. It was interesting to note, though, that when my wife decided not to become involved in the group and I got drawn more heavily into it and we were suffering problems in our marriage, and my wife began to question and have some questions and doubts and criticism about my involvement, that suddenly they didn't think we were probably twin flames anymore. And we certainly weren't soulmates. And that in fact, maybe this was a karmic marriage, meaning the lowest form of marriage you could have, something that can't be resolved or ever worked out. And that, Keith, maybe you ought to think about leaving your wife and just coming to live with the group. For such an omniscient group with such a hold on the truth in the beginning, how could they have mistaken that we were a karmic marriage versus twin flames? Things sure changed. This is very common in groups. Love and acceptance if you can call it that, is strictly conditional on accepting and believing their beliefs without question and practicing their practices loyally. Any crack in that, then condition, love, acceptance is pulled out from under you. It's very conditional. The next characteristic that you should be wary of as you're out there in the marketplace of groups is that questioning and criticism is discouraged. It's discouraged because questions and criticism are ultimately a threat to the group and to your loyalty to the group. If you evoke enough doubt and questions in yourself and spread that within the group, you may get other people thinking and wondering about what's really going on here. And you may leave the group, and you may pull other people out of the group with you, and you may expose them to society through the media or in other ways. And that's a threat. That's a big threat to these groups because they're hiding behind lies and deception and manipulation. And so that questioning is seen as a sign of weakness, doubting is seen as a sign of weakness, or a sign that your loyalty is cracking somehow. And that questions and criticism need to be done away with altogether if you're going to be an adherent. CUT warned constantly against evil forces out there constantly at work to pull us chosen ones off the path to God. And that these evil forces were working through the media and the information the media was giving out. And that the forces were working through our friends. And the worst forces were working through the people that were closest to us, our family, our spouses. Of course, the worst forces are going to be working through them. They're the people being most affected by the changes and the harm that is coming as a result of your involvement. And so they are the ones that begin to question and doubt and try to plant questions in your mind. So they cut you off from any criticism and questioning. CUT, at the time I was in, and they may still have this, had fear and doubt decrees. That any time you were feeling fear about your involvement in the group or having doubts about it, you could do a certain chant or prayer, which I will talk about chanting in a little while in more depth, that would rid your mind of those thoughts so that you no longer had them. If you come across a group where nobody has any questions, any doubts, anything negative to say about the group, then your flag ought to go up. Something there is wrong. I belong to an Episcopal church that's wonderful, but there's certain things that are problems about it that need to be worked on, and we talk about them. The next would be an ends justify the means philosophy. The ends justify the means. That the group will do anything or nearly anything to achieve its goals because they believe they have salvation of you and mankind in mind, including breaking the law, cheating people out of money, splitting up families, and on and on and on. It's done for the purpose of the so-called greater good. It's okay to break laws, it's okay to split families up, it's okay to abuse children for our greater good purpose, because we really have the greater good of everyone in mind. So we can be afforded these transgressions. The leader in the group comes to view itself above the law. And examples of this abound in Church Universal. Most remember when Ed Francis and a church member, Vernon Hamilton, were convicted of possession of illegal machine guns and 120,000 rounds of armor-piercing ammunition as one of the more drastic examples in that group. The ends justified the means because the presumed reason for doing this was to protect the chosen ones, the church members, during the Armageddon that they were predicting. If you dig into newspaper articles, magazine articles, media accounts, you will find example after example of CUT and its ends justify the means philosophy, as well as most destructive cults. You'll find the same. 6, critics are intimidated. Again, critics of the group, anyone outside the group, are viewed as a threat because the group realizes that critics generally are armed with the truth about who they are and what they're about, and that the leaders in the groups cannot stand up to this honest scrutiny. Instead of debating the message, they tend to attack the person. They attack the person instead of debating the message as an avoidance of even getting into the debate in the first time. We see the Scientologist organization using lawsuits continually to bring critics down to their knees, to harass them and to break them financially and emotionally for criticizing their group. And if this is beginning to paint a picture of totalitarian Soviet Union for you, it should, because there really are serious parallels between these types of groups and any totalitarian system. CUT casts critics as evil people who are conspiring against them. Conspiracy theories abound in many cults. When I was in the group, anyone who criticized or wasn't in line, we would do smash, blast, annihilate, shatter, dissolve, and consume decrees repeatedly and vehemently against our critics, believing that somehow spiritually we would bring them to their knees. Smash, blast, annihilate, shatter, dissolve, and consume. This is where practices aren't matching teachings. This is a group that claims Christian teachings. And I don't remember ever hearing Christ say anything like that. The first question people ask me when I come to do a talk like this or any of my talks, am I in some kind of a danger to do this? Why would people ask that if this group was, or any of these groups were legitimate? They ask that because critics are stepping out of the totalitarian system and threatening these groups. And there is potentially danger if you push them into a deep enough corner. Jim Jones retreated to the Guyana jungles, not because he thought it would be a nice place to be, but it was a way to escape critics. He had been discovered in California and was escaping his critics and attempting to isolate his members down there. But he got found out there, and the criticism kept coming in the government investigation, and he was cornered. And look what happened there. So people ask me, am I in danger for doing this? Well, I hope not. Critics are often just passed off. Their characters are assassinated, or they're simply passed off, as I was, by Ed Francis, the vice president of CUT at the time I left the group, as, quote, a disgruntled ex-member, unquote. Let me tell you, there are a lot of disgruntled, hundreds, maybe thousands, of disgruntled ex-CUT members. Why did they leave? I guess there's something wrong with all of us. And that's what the groups would like to have you believe. It's something wrong with the member why they leave. It's nothing wrong with the group, it's them. It's some flaw in their character. I don't think so. The next characteristic would be the use of deceit in recruitment and in practices. Deception. And I talked about deception in the 4 key elements. Deception plays a big role in destructive cult activity. They misrepresent themselves on who they are and what they have in mind for you when they're recruiting you into the group. They misrepresent what the group is and what it's about. They typically hide from the person the full extent of the commitment that will be required, the level of control that will be exerted, and the changes in lifestyle and personality that will result from the involvement. They usually promise wonderful things that will occur for you if you become involved, and they don't happen in reality. They often hide who they actually are if they have a well-known reputation, if they're notoriously known. For example, the Unification Church, Reverend Moon, has dozens, if not hundreds, of front group organizations to hide the fact that it's the Unification Church coming in contact with you, because he knows full well that his group has a bad name. This becomes relevant for many people. We have political leaders in our country who speak at moon-sponsored events under other names. President Bush, former President Bush, recently spoke at a moon-sponsored event that was under another name. We should be alarmed about that. I am. On college campuses, college organizations by the name of CARP and CASA on college campuses are specifically there to recruit unwitting suspects into the Unification Church by inviting them to a dinner, by providing them with a social group, by coming away to camp for the weekend. Deception, we're talking about deception here. Why would a legitimate group have to deceive you to get you involved? Why can't they be upfront right from the beginning about who they are and what is really going on and what's going to happen in your life as a result? CUT is no different in this area either. I'm aware of a notebook, a recruitment notebook of guidelines in that organization of the recipe of how to go about to recruit people into the CUT organization. And members are trained in how to recruit people in. And usually, the recruitment into CUT does not start with some big poster with Elizabeth Clare Prophet on it and the name Church Universal and Triumphant on it, because enough people know enough that there's something wrong there that maybe they better stay away from this. Typically, the first invite into the group will be under the guise of the Summit University and will be presented as some university lecture on some relevant topic such as relationships or something of that nature. And so you go to a lecture sponsored by Summit University on relationships. And before you know it, you're learning how to decree, you're learning all kinds of spiritual information, and you're being pressured to continue contact with them and come to other meetings. Why couldn't they tell me in the first place who they were and what they were about? That's what I want to know. I have something here about leaders again, which I've already mentioned. And the leaders have the supernatural powers and omniscience. They're beyond reproach. We've talked about that. Another characteristic is the isolation of members. Members are often physically, emotionally, psychologically isolated from friends, family, and society at large as a means to maintain total control. It's really, I don't believe, any accident that CUT is headquartered itself on an isolated ranch in rural Montana that keeps members away from media and critics and far away from friends and families. It's very difficult for people on a ranch in Montana to have access to their families and information that might get them questioning, might get them thinking. By the same token, it's not necessary to actually live with a group for this kind of isolation to occur. This is a hard thing, perhaps, to understand. I never lived with Church Universal and Triumphant. I lived with my wife outside of the group, continued to work in the community. But CUT, through its thought reform processes, succeeded in reforming my thinking to the point where I was cut off from my own thinking any longer. I was cut off from my own feelings, and my own thoughts and feelings were replaced with the thoughts, feelings, beliefs of theirs. And so in a sense, I was isolated from myself any longer. And this isolation from myself led to dramatic changes in my beliefs, my values, my lifestyle, and created serious problems in my relationship with my wife. I was talking to somebody today, and I remembered that when I first came out of the group, the first thing I said to my wife was, "I'm back." Well, I hadn't actually been anywhere physically. We had been living together through the years I was in the group. And I said, "I'm back," because I was back. Me hadn't been there for a few years. I felt like we hadn't been together. There truly was that isolation built in. I'm back. And then I said, the nightmare is over. The next, groups that are demanding full-time commitment from you. Total full-time commitment. Where the majority of one's time and energy becomes devoted to the group so that there is no room for anyone or anything else in your life. That you feel you can never do enough to save yourself and the world and to attend to all the activities that the group would have you attend to. There's always more demands, always something that must be done, and it's urgent because as a member you feel this is vitally important work. You're at the cutting edge of saving the world, so how can you slack off? So that things like children, spouses, jobs, recreation, families, social time, that all falls by the wayside. That's not important any longer. The only thing that becomes important is the sole purpose of being in the group and attending to those demands. For me, by the end of my involvement in CUT, I was spending 2 to 3 days, and I wasn't living with the group, as I mentioned, 2 to 3 days per week in church meetings that lasted between 2 to 8 hours per meeting. I was decreeing or chanting at least 4 hours per day, and always wished and felt guilty like I should be doing more. All the extra time beyond that was used for recruiting or reading endless materials that would arrive in my mailbox from the church daily. And this alienated me from my own life, and it served for them to gain more control over me. So, full-time commitment. Next would be the offering of simplistic solutions to life's problems. The old saying, if it seems too good to be true, it probably is, and I feel like I learned that the hard way. CUT really seemed too good to be true to me when I first became involved. It was a utopia. I thought it had all the answers. It was going to solve everything. And that's the appeal for a lot of people. I mean, who wouldn't like to know that there's some group or person out there that could just solve everything, and that if we just embraced them and became involved, all the garbage in our lives and life in general would just melt away. That would be wonderful. But unfortunately, that's something that fairy tales and fantasies are written of. They offer a solution simplistically, not only to all of problems, but specifically to the vulnerability that you're presenting them. They can fix that in you. For me, my vulnerability, I was a young adult searching for personal identity and spiritual meaning as I was coming out of college. And CUT came along and fit the bill for me and provided me what I thought was both. And they provided me with a relatively simple formula for personal and global salvation, which was basically if I decreed and chanted enough, and if I was loyal enough, a good Chela, followers in CUT are termed Chelas, if I was a good Chela, that all these good things would happen. Good things didn't happen as a result. And in fact, they weren't answers to my life's problems. They created a lot more problems for me than I had in the first place. The next would be the misuse of mind-altering techniques, which I touched upon in the 4 key elements of a cult. Destructive groups use excessive chanting, prayer, speaking in tongues, meditation, long, confusing lectures to create an altered hypnotic state. The operative term here is excessive. These things are used excessively, and they're used with a manipulative intention. Many of these things on their own and used within reason are fine. I don't want people to go away thinking, oh man, can I pray in church? Or I'm confused by a lecture, this must be a cult. No. Hopefully some of you are feeling that way now. The thing is, when it's used, these techniques are used excessively and for the intention of controlling people, that they become destructive and harmful. What happens is people go into trance states, common hypnotic trance states, through these techniques, not even knowing that they're going into trance states. Many of us go in and out of trance states and we don't even know it on our own. Some of you may find your heads bobbing right now as I'm talking. You're still awake, but you're kind of bobbing and not hearing me. That's a trance. Or highway hypnosis, where suddenly the road comes back into focus. You weren't sleeping, you're not quite sure where you are and how far you've gone. The point there is that you can go into a hypnotic trance without even knowing that somebody's employing that technique on you and using it on you. Trance states can be dangerous when someone is unethically using them on you. And by that I mean, go into a trance state and your critical thinking capacities go way down. You're not thinking critically. You become more like a sponge and things just become absorbed. So this is an opportunity for the cults to bombard you with information, beliefs, values, things they want you to do in this uncritical state, and they become inscribed in your conscience and have the power of exerting control and influence over you. The other way they're used, trance states, is for thought-stopping techniques. Is that if you can get somebody to trance out whenever they're having doubts or questions or critical thoughts, if you can get them to trance out, you can get them, when you're in a trance, you're not going to have those thoughts any longer, and it erases them. That's known as thought-stopping. In CUT, we were taught to decree, chant, as a primary means to heal ourselves, the world, to get money, to solve problems, to cure medical ills, for political problems. You named it, there was a decree for it. There's hundreds of decrees in these thick books for every situation imaginable. So that, as I mentioned before, you feel the need to decree for hours each day and as much as you possibly can to take care of all these different situations. I've been to a conference where on the ranch, CUT's ranch, where we were up around 7 in the morning listening to Elizabeth Clare Prophet and decreeing, and still found ourselves listening to Elizabeth Clare Prophet and decreeing at 5 a.m. the next morning. That's sleep deprivation first, which has an effect on people, and that's chanting and long, confusing lectures. There's no way to think critically about anything. And as a sidelight, in the middle of all that, about 2 in the morning, Elizabeth Clare Prophet gave a decree, or she channeled a message from one of the so-called masters. And suddenly, there was a great need that we had to buy these certain rare rocks and gems if we were to be on this right spiritual path. And lo and behold, the store opened at 2 in the morning. And guess what happened? Everybody flocked in and spent who knows how much on that stuff, including me. What I'd like to do for you now is I have a recording of decrees, and I want to play an example of it for you just so you can see, get an idea for yourselves of how this kind of chanting could put you into a mesmerized kind of state, a trance state. Yeah, I've had that comment before. People have said, sold, at the end of that. I don't mean to poke fun at members who believe in this, because it's a very important part of their religion and their beliefs. And so I don't want to poke fun and put that down. What I want to bring to attention is the effect that can have on you psychologically in terms of trance and what that can do to a person. Imagine doing that for hours upon hours a day, every day of your life. It would be no different than being an alcoholic, really, and drinking to put you in an altered state. Well, there would be some differences, but there would be similarities. The next quality is destroys or alienates relationships with family and friends. Those outside of the group come to be seen as the enemy. They represent the threat to your own spiritual path and that the control the group has over you. They are often blamed as a cause for your problems, lack of enlightenment, etc., and that you need to distance yourself from these people. Besides that, as I mentioned, there's no time for relationships outside of the group. And when I was in CUT, I no longer had time for my wife, family, and friends because my spiritual work took first priority and was more important. So relationships are affected. And what are we if we don't have our relationships with our children, with our wives, with our husbands, with our friends? And that's, in my mind, a lot of what life is to have those relationships. For me, my personality changed so dramatically, my diet, my beliefs, my activities, my emotional affect. My wife didn't even know me or couldn't relate to me any longer. She'd ask me, "Who are you? Where have you gone?" And eventually, as I mentioned, I was advised to leave my wife, that might be the best thing to do because we had gone into that karmic marriage, and that perhaps I should maybe think about moving, building a bomb shelter, and really cutting off. Another characteristic is the control of diet and sleep deprivation. Diets in most of destructive cults are usually unhealthy, low in protein, not well balanced, and the effect of that is weakening the body. If your body's weak, your mind is weak. If you're not well nourished, we know that with our children in school, they have to eat a good breakfast or they're not turned on properly for the day, their brains aren't. It's the same with us. And if you're weakened, your mind's weakened, then that's an increased level of control the group can have over you. You have less resistance to put up. The diet I was on when I was in CUT, and it changes a lot, and they change it from time to time, was designed to purify my body as the temple of God. And so that I ate only fruits and vegetables and fruit juices with enema fasts 1 day per week. And I was encouraged to do longer fasts periodically. I ate no meats, alcohol, no sugars. And none of that is bad in and of itself, but when you're only eating fruits and vegetables and fasting once a week for 24 hours, that takes a toll on your body. I lost about 15 pounds and was sick continually. My health was being affected as a result of this. And certainly I was more malleable in the hands of the leader in the group in that condition. Sleep is also deprived. As I mentioned, there's so much to do, you never feel like you can do enough, that you're up till all hours and you're up early in the morning doing this stuff, and you're not getting the required amount of sleep that you need. And I know that when I went to that conference, I wasn't getting hardly any sleep. Another thing you'll note with destructive groups is that their lack of service to the community. They may tout some token service things they're doing for the community, but there is a dearth of community service. It just isn't there. The energies of the group are centered around recruiting and fundraising to accumulate wealth, power, and prestige for the leader. Little or nothing is given back to public service or for those in need. In fact, many times what you find is that the members themselves are the most needy due to giving up money and possessions to the group and being paid very little. To my knowledge, CUT is not engaged and hasn't been in public service. Many members have been on welfare in CUT due to the little pay by the church and their lack of jobs and what they've turned over to the organization. The focus is continually on raising money and bringing new recruits in. Not only is there a lack of service, but accompanied with that, there's often a lack of compassion for those in need. Oftentimes in cults, and CUT was no exception, there isn't such thing really as a victim. People are viewed as flawed to begin with, and if something terrible happens to them, it was their own fault to begin with, and they need to kind of pay that debt. CUT's view of somebody who is starving, crippled, would be that, through their interpretation of karma, that those people brought their own karma on from past lifetimes, and that they're just paying their karmic debt and they need to go through it. So we don't have to help them. Next characteristic would be to rid you of your old ways of thinking. Thought reform usually includes convincing members that their current beliefs, thoughts, feelings, relationships, connections with social institutions are the cause of all their problems. That if they could rid themselves of these thoughts and feelings and beliefs and values and replace them with the group's prescribed thoughts and beliefs, etc., then their problems will resolve. In CUT, one of the stated goals is to achieve a state of higher God or Christ consciousness. So you did the chanting to rid yourself of what was termed your lower human thought forms, which really, your lower human thought forms and feelings are your feelings, your thoughts, your personality. We need to get rid of that and replace it with the groups. One story that still affects me when I think about it, because I know how much I love my wife, and no one can ever tell me again that I don't love my wife. But CUT told me that my love for my wife was a lower human thought form and was not true godly love. The final characteristic is that the group exerts near total control over its members. Members come to lose their ability to think freely and make decisions for themselves. They become dependent on the leaders of the group for all their decisions and their actions. They become passive pawns of the leader. And as I mentioned, this is a very dangerous situation for people to be in. And this occurs through many of the things that I mentioned already: the authoritarian divine leader who is beyond reproach, the deception, the misuse of mind-altering techniques, isolation, diet and sleep deprivation, love bombing. And then to add to that, I would add mind control or thought reform techniques, which, if you remember back to the beginning, the mind control and thought reform was the fourth key element in a definition of a destructive cult. Robert J. Lifton wrote a book entitled Thought Reform and the Psychology of Totalism. It's a seminal work on brainwashing, actually. He studied Chinese war prisoners, Western prisoners of Chinese prison camps in communist China in the 1950s. And he interviewed them extensively. And out of these interviews, he was able to call out 8 motifs that went into a thought reform program to control people. And we've come to find that if a group meets 6 or more of those 8 motifs, then they in fact are totalitarian in nature, that they are employing a thought reform program. CUT meets all 8 of those motifs. I don't have time to go into the motifs. That's a whole other lecture. It would take a couple hours to go through all 8 motifs and how CUT is employing it. But what I can say is that what's woven through those motifs is the intense and excessive use of guilt and fear, intricately woven into the doctrine to control people. Guilt in that you have to do your part to save the world and usher in this golden age, this tremendous burden, and that if you let down at all, then you're letting not only the group down, but mankind down and the world down. There's this tremendous guilt. You're carrying the burden of the world on your shoulders. And that guilt is used to manipulate constantly. Even more than guilt, fear is invoked. And you'll find in destructive groups over and over that people are motivated by fear that is generated by the leadership. There's often a continual state of some kind of crisis, a sense of urgency to motivate people into action. I was told if I ever left CUT that I would be cast into outer darkness, hell, never to know God again in my life if I were to leave. And that if I were to leave, I would no longer have the protection of the group. Because in fact, my protection and well-being was dependent on being in the group. And that if I left, the group was a little bit stronger and the world might be a little less stronger, and the world would be in a little more danger. That's fearful stuff, if you believe it, and I believed it. It was a scary thing, leaving the group. CUT most recently is noted for its use of fear and its end-of-the-world prophecies of the nuclear holocaust, and manipulating people through this fear to give up their jobs and families and lives all over the world. People have given these things up and left destroyed families all over the world to come here to Montana to build a bomb shelter on CUT leased land so that they can be saved from this potential Armageddon. They may believe that if they like, okay, and that is fine. I don't call into question that belief. But this kind of ploy is used over and over again in millenarian groups, and much harm has come of it. And it's an intense fear that is manipulating people and hurting people. And one of the main reasons my family chose to rescue me at the time they did out of CUT was because I was this far away from giving it all up and moving to Montana and buying into the bomb shelters. And I thank God to this day that that didn't happen. Those are some of the characteristics you want to look for with a destructive group. I want to move now, towards the end of my talk, into the area of prevention. There's so much more we could talk about here tonight. I'm just hoping this opens the doors for some of you and raises some awareness to get you started in your own research of this topic and your own understanding of this topic. Don't just take my word for it. Go out there, look up the materials. I have a crate full of books here, which is just the tip of the iceberg on this subject. There's reams of articles written on CUT and other groups that are well known. It's out there, and it can be found. You have to look it up. So don't just take my word for it. Check into it yourselves. The first thing I want to say about preventing from getting involved in a cult, as I mentioned at the beginning of the talk, is that no one is totally immune. No one is. I don't want to evoke undue fear in people here, but nobody is totally immune. If we equip ourselves with information and we're educated, we have a good chance that in those vulnerable times that will inevitably come up in our own lives, that we will be armored and protected against such involvement. So don't assume and it could never happen to me or those I love attitude. We are all susceptible at different times. As I mentioned, cults play on our vulnerabilities. So try to maintain that kind of an attitude. Educate yourself and your children and people you know and care about cults. Learn more about it yourself. Share some of what you learned here tonight about their characteristics, their recruitment tactics in particular, because that's the first encounter with the group, and specific information about particular groups that maybe you know of or are worried about. Educate yourself. Support cult awareness education in schools, churches, the mental health community. This kind of education is really hard to get out there. People don't want to touch it. They all get so scared of that First Amendment issue that the cults are putting out there in propaganda, really. I'm not telling anyone they can't believe what they want and they can't have their religious freedom. That's not what this is about, and I hope you've gotten that message. So the community needs to support education in the schools, cult education, awareness in schools, churches, the mental health community. There's a serious lack of it everywhere I go. To the best of our ability, we need to provide healthy, meaningful social, family, and spiritual experiences for our youth so that there is a sense of purpose and belonging, and that their questions can be answered and that they can be supported and keep people connected as best as we can. Next, be aware if you're in a vulnerable state yourself. If you're going through some trauma or a really hard time in your life or a transition, be aware you are vulnerable. You're having a rough time. That leaves you in a more vulnerable state. Be aware of those times in your life. And watch your actions and watch what you do and don't do. Probably those times aren't the times to totally commit yourself to a group. And finally, be a good consumer of groups, of their ideas and beliefs. Don't be so open-minded that your brains fall out. We value open-mindedness. We want to be open to the exchange of ideas and talking, but don't be so open that you don't question anything. Be skeptical. Ask good questions. Be a critical thinker and scrutinize before making big commitments. Don't assume, as many of us do in our society, that all are worthy of our trust automatically, just because they're a certain group or they say this or that. People have to earn our trust and show that they're worthy of it by their actions and who they are. Some questions you can ask to be a critical thinker, or things that you can do. Research the group. Have people left this group? Why have they left it? What do the ex-members say about the group? Is everyone totally happy in this group that you're encountering? If they are, is that realistic that everybody is totally happy and everything is perfect? How are former members perceived by the group? I mean, obviously, I was told I'd be cast into outer darkness, and have been told by members of the Church Universal Triumphant they wish they never even introduced me to these teachings if they knew I was going to go around and talk like this. I'm not perceived very well by the group I was in, and former members by any group aren't perceived well. What tangible proof exists for the positive results that the group espouses? People can say anything about anything, but where is the evidence of what they're saying? If I had investigated the evidence of what CUT was telling me, I would have seen a wake of destruction and harm and devastation. The positive results would not have been there. Where does the money go in these groups? Where's all this money going that you're turning over so that you don't have enough money to eat and pay your rent and barely survive? Where is it going when it goes into the group? Most likely you'll find it's going to the leader and into recruitment efforts and for amassing wealth. How much emphasis does a group place on recruitment and fundraising? Under the surface, does that seem to be what it's all about? Here's a good one to ask. Are members free to question, or is there pressure in the group that you notice that questions aren't okay, doubts aren't okay? Is the leader revered beyond reproach? Does the view of the leader by the group seem to be godlike, someone that you can't call into question? Does the group claim exclusive possession of the truth? If that's true, I know there's up to 3,000 groups out there that are claiming exclusive possession of the truth right now. Does the group manifest an us versus them mentality, the polarization I spoke of earlier? Here's a good one. Would members still be your friend if you left the group? Supposedly the people I was in CUT with were my best friends in the world. We were in this thing together, and we were close and we were tight. I've been contacted once by one of those members since leaving to tell me he wished he never introduced me to the teachings in the first place. These were my friends. These are the people who really loved me. So would they still be your friend if you left? And what kind of group is that if you're rejected because you don't accept them? That's not tolerance. That's not the kind of tolerance that these groups are claiming that they espouse, but it's not tolerance. What kind of time commitment is expected? You finding that this group is beginning to consume all of your life and all of your time? That's not healthy. You need to have balance. Do members maintain healthy relationships with outside family and friends? Are members pressured to change beliefs as proof of commitment? What community service is being performed? They're such a wonderful group, we would expect some community service, some good things being given back to the community. Where is it? Is the group promising too much? Are they a too good to be true group? If you're thinking to yourself, God, this is the greatest thing I've ever come across, I finally found it, an alarm ought to go off in your head. Does a group tend to build people up and then tear them down, make them feel really good about themselves and then admonish them and beat them down, and creating and evoking guilt and shame? Those are some questions, but I hope you can remember some of those. Hopefully, I've increased your awareness and understanding of what a destructive cult is, that we are all potentially vulnerable, and that we as individuals, our friends, families, and communities are all potential victims. I hope that I've armed everyone with some information and questions that will prevent themselves or their loved ones from becoming involved. And beyond that, if you know someone's involved, some information that will help you, maybe to help them. I thank you for your time and attention.
Promise them salvation, cover up the path, scare them with damnation, lead them anywhere, you can lead them anywhere, teach them shame and guilt, stimulate their fears, make them doubt themselves, lead them anywhere, you can lead them anywhere, now that they are sleeping, lead them anywhere. Build around them borders, encumber them with laws, replace their names with numbers, lead them anywhere, you can lead them anywhere. Beat those who are different, disown the ones who fail, refuse those who are destitute, lead them anywhere, you can lead them anywhere. Now that they are sleeping, lead them anywhere. Discourage self-reliance, encourage sacrifice, reward them for obedience, lead them anywhere, you can lead them anywhere. Starve the non-producers, mock enlightened minds, kill the troublemakers, lead them anywhere, you can lead them anywhere.